For a long time, people have been trying to intervene to address some major societal problems, but I think what we're all coming to realise is that really complex problems can't be solved on a vertical basis. And so actually it requires a gathering of a whole pile of players who bring a whole pile of different things to the table. The social impact of partnerships is still a fairly new area, and there isn't a lot of documentary evidence. The more that we can encourage people to share case studies, the better. With PBA, we've just undertaken a big study with World Vision, who internationally have rolled out partnership brokering skills right at the very lowest grassroots levels throughout developing countries and the developed world. And they've just completed a big document which is looking at the impact of that partnership brokering on their relationships with communities. And then the next stage of it, which is yet to come, will be looking at, well, what is the impact from a community development point of view? And they're going to make that available as a public document, which I think is fantastic. So the thing about Australia, there's actually some really cutting edge partnership work happening. Quite extraordinary, particularly at the government level, which is really exciting. But if we don't share that, we're not going to learn from it. And I'd also encourage people to think about writing up bad case studies as well. Well, not bad case studies, but we can always learn. And there's always a way to anonymise information, providing you've got all of the partners' permission, so that it can become a learning tool. If you have a really genuinely equitable, trusting relationship, it really frees people up to brainstorm because they feel safe. And, if we're talking about cross-sectoral partnerships, so you might have a government representative, someone from the NGO community, maybe a philanthropic foundation, perhaps the business sector, you've got 4 sets of heads there and all their associated organisations who have a different culture, a different way of looking, different skill sets. That's actually where you can get some really exciting solutions happening. In Australia, over the last couple of years, I've been doing a little bit of work with DEWA, which is around school to business transitions in the secondary school sector. And DEWA did some really interesting stuff there. They actually set up 100 or funded 100 partnership brokering organisations who were not funded. They didn't have grants to make, but their role was really just around brokering partners and bringing people together to design outcomes. And this happened right across rural, regional and urban Australia. That was a very exciting program, and I think quite innovative even on a global basis, and has achieved something that people didn't think could be achieved, in that partnerships can be brokered without money. I think what we're starting to see internationally is a lot of the partnership work has gone from being small and discrete projects happening at a very local level within an area of one country, for example, to taking it much more to a large-scale macro level. And this is where I was talking earlier about partnerships being applied to try and solve really complex problems. So there's a program I'm working on which is across the South Asia region, which is trying to address issues around climate resilience and sustainable development. And that's working with a very broad mix of partners right from across the region, where it's looking at interboundary water issues, for example. I mean, it's really very big stuff and really difficult problems that haven't been solved despite years and years and years of funding support. So, watch this space. It is quite new, this type of approach, as to whether or not you can really achieve very substantial change on the big questions that are facing us in international development. But I think the exciting thing is that people are really embracing it as a way of trying to, untap creativity and opportunity, rather than trying to work in silos, beside each other. So it's very exciting. I've probably been involved in 30-odd partnerships over the last couple of years, and there really are some common themes, no matter which country or which sector you're working in. I think power imbalance is a huge issue. You can't always have equal partnerships. I don't think we should confuse equal with equity. But equity is about maximising mutuality, I think, as in people are understanding that everyone is there for a reason. They have their own objectives and their own contributions. And the more you can build that mutuality, the much more likely your chances are of building equitable partnerships where people feel free to comment, criticise, contribute, give feedback, innovate. The other thing that I think is very important is around transparency. People will say, well, I know you've asked me a question around that. I can't tell you the answer for this reason. Now that's transparency in a good partnership. People aren't naive, they get it. So transparency I think is important because it builds respect, and respect is really critical. And I think the other thing that increasingly is very important is ensuring that organisations have permission to partner. So when they're sitting at the partnership table, everybody really needs to be empowered to represent their organisation, which can mean things like making sure that their systems and processes are supportive of the partnering approach. Because what we'll often see is that great partnerships, and I'm sure you'll know lots of these, are often established by really passionate individuals. And so quite often what I'll see if I'm coming in to review a partnership, where partnerships come into problems is when those champions leave. So managing transitions of people at the partnership table is really key, and thinking about induction of those people. And the individual partners are not the only people responsible for inducting new people at the partnering table. All the partners are. And I think that's really important because partnerships develop their own culture, which is quite unique to a partnership. If you are trying to support and promote a particular way of working, but you have intractable contract agreements, for example, which may be very master-servant in style, often there's a big disconnect. So if you go into an initial partnership negotiation with a really enthusiastic champion, everyone thinks it's great and wonderful, say that's great, let's work together, and then, oh yeah, by the way, you must sign this 60-page document, and we're not going to move on copyright issues or intellectual property, for example, and this is non-negotiable, and these are our reporting requirements, and you have to comply with that, and it's just non-negotiable. You might as well tear up the partnership, let alone the contract agreement. I think it's really critical to identify what the contributions and resources are that people are going to be making. Funding is absolutely critical, but equally that partnership is not going to happen without the partner who's sitting at the table, who may be bringing networks or maybe bringing their influence or their technical skills or whatever. So it's valuing both of those contributions is key. Of course, people might have to sign a grant agreement. I really recommend separating that out from a partnering agreement, because once the money is on the table, people can only think about the money, which is not conducive to good partnering. It's a really good question, and I would say no. I think you need to make very conscious decisions about when you want to partner and in what way. I would, however, like to debunk the idea that partnerships are very time intensive. They can be, but actually what we find is it's a bit like, if we're talking about Indigenous Australia, that investment in the yarning time that happens at the start of a relationship. And actually anywhere in Asia or the Pacific, people are used to working there, you'll know that it's actually about establishing a relationship. So what typically happens in a new partnership where you've got partners who don't know each other is that they need to spend time exploring each other's constraints and opportunities together, and how they like working, and do you like working with them, that type of thing. But actually, if you invest in that time up front, what typically happens is by the time you get ready to sign the partnering agreement, things really go fast, which is usually the opposite way to how things will happen in a Western contracting situation, where you sign a contract, then you figure it all out together, and then you get into difficulties and dispute, and it comes back to more contract negotiations. But really good partnerships actually tend to flow very, very smoothly. Well, there's two different types of partnership brokers. So there are internal brokers, who are basically people who are operating from within their organisation, sitting at the partnership table, and that's a very challenging role. I was a internal broker for 20 odd years, and I'll tell you it's much easier being an external one. In an ideal world, every single person sitting at the table is acting as an internal broker, and that means you've got a bit of split personality going on in your head, because part of your head is thinking about how am I representing the interests of my organisation, but the other part of your head is saying, what do I have to do on behalf of this partnership to keep the partnership moving forward? And quite often that'll come down to asking difficult questions at the right time. As an external broker, you can often be a circuit breaker or a linker. So you might be even earlier in the partnering cycle and be brought in to help make due diligence assessments of potential partner organisations. Sometimes I'm called in when partnerships have gone to seed, which is a shame. Quite often I'll come in to assist people to review partnerships, although I'm really keen to see partnerships develop that ability to review themselves. And sometimes a partnership broker might be brought in to help you move on from a partnership which might be changing or closing down. Yeah, look, we talk about partnership brokering being quite a sophisticated skill set, and I think that's right, because you need to know when to intervene at the right time and what particular skills to use. So, I mean, there's things that you can learn, like facilitation, for example. Interest-based negotiation is a really important skill, because I think with partners, you're constantly trying to move them away from positions to a shared interest. To me, I think actually you need really strong leadership skills, but you need to be able to lead from behind, especially as the broker. You don't want everyone to be looking to you for the decisions. You're constantly trying to push that decision making, that leadership back to the partners. I haven't seen a good partnership broker who isn't very high on the emotional intelligence scale. I think active listening is a really key skill, and active listening is a lot more than just listening to what people are saying. It's watching their body language, for example, and hearing what they're saying behind the words that are going on, because a big challenge as a broker is trying to get people to uncover their hidden agendas. I think being able to see the big picture is really important, so that you can ask the right questions at the right time, and I think fundamentally a really big commitment to a results focus is important, because a lot of people have the misconception that partnerships are a big talk fest and that's all they're about. And actually, quite often I think a broker, their role is actually to ask the really hard and tough questions to keep things moving. So at the end of the day, you might not be everyone's favourite person, but people will be able to walk out of the meeting and say, oh, actually, we're really moving here. One of the things that we really like to encourage in brokers is being self-aware. And a very genuinely self-aware internal broker will know when they are not the right person to be handling the situation that they're currently in. Another key time, I think, is for organisations who are not really experienced partners. One of the mining companies that who've participated in the training program that we run, it's not uncommon for them to invest quite a lot of time and effort on helping their partners to be ready to partner, and they might bring in an external broker to help them to do that. Which can take the heat out of the relationship. This can particularly happen when you've got a big power imbalance. So if we're talking about like a big mining company and a little local community organisation or Indigenous community organisation, they might not have anyone with good negotiation skills. Whereas if you build negotiation skills, for example, within that partner, by the time they come to negotiating the partnering agreement, they may well be much more able to represent the interests of their organisation equitably. Very typically, even very successful partnerships will often bring in an external broker to help facilitate a review process. I can tell you it's fundamental, and if it's not handled well, can be very problematic. But okay, so I come from the development sector where there's a lot of focus on evaluating outputs, for example, project activities, what's gone on. And on the face of it, everything's going great. But in your gut, everybody knows that this is a disastrous program. And quite often it's because nobody is assessing the relationship, the partnership processes, the governance, for example, of how the partnership works and makes decisions. So not to assess the partnership processes that are involved and the people that are involved, how effectively they're working together, is missing something fundamental in the evaluation space. But what you have to be very careful around, partnerships are like any good human relationships. They have to be nurtured. And what isn't great is if you bring in external evaluators who have no understanding of partnerships to design your evaluation process, because it can be very undermining. So I'm a big fan of the utilisation school of evaluation, whereby you involve the people who are actually going to be using the information in the design process. And that would say that basically the only people who are experts in the partnership are the partners themselves, and they need to be involved in both the design and the conduct and the analysis of the information around reviewing the partnership. I actually think it's really fundamental, and in fact it can be a really great way to build trust. So you can deal with some very difficult issues. I did a review of a very large regional mental health partnership in Victoria a couple of years ago. And through the review, it became obvious that the governance structures that were in place were entirely inappropriate and ineffective. And that was challenging for people to talk about it, but we designed the review so that people had the opportunity to talk about things independently before they came back and discussed it as a group. And as a result, they entirely changed the governance structure, put it on its head, re-looked at the membership of the partnership, who should be, who shouldn't be here, are we missing key people from the table? And it was a great outcome. You need to involve the people who are going to be using the information in the entire review and evaluation process. You'd be wanting to facilitate probably individual conversations with partners first in the first time around, and then getting together a conversation where people were talking about what's worked well from a partnership point of view, what hasn't worked well. I'd probably rather phrase that from the point of view of what might we do differently next time. But the focus on the review should be around problem solving and moving things forward, having difficult conversations that might not have happened. And the other thing I think growing out of there is it's really key not to leave partnership review to just a formal once a year process, but that at every partnership meeting there should be room on the agenda just to have like a quick health check to say, how are we travelling together? Have there been any issues which we might have handled differently in the last 3 months? If partners are in a really trusting relationship with each other, absolutely they can evaluate each other, although rather than saying I'm going to evaluate you, it should be more about let's together evaluate us. I think that's the key thing. So you might have representatives from 3 organisations, and together you agree what the review questions will be, and together you find the answers to those. Sometimes people don't feel confident, or they might feel that there's a difficult relationship. As you build trust, you might start with an external reviewer for the first or the second time, but part of their remit should be to help build the capacity of that partnership to review its own abilities internally. Firstly, this self-awareness thing, so making an assessment yourself of what you're good at and what you're not, and identifying if there are areas that you can address through formal training. The Partnership Brokers Association has a fantastic dedicated specialist program. Big fan of it, having done it. I train in it, so there's my conflict of interest statement. The other thing I'm a big fan of is learning by observing. So if you have the opportunity to sit in or maybe offer to be a scribe for an existing experienced partnership broker and watch how they handle themselves or handle a partnership, it's a fantastic way of learning. The other thing is there are communities of practice. I've been able to be involved with people from around the world under PBA, where they have a training community of practice, they have evaluation communities of practice, and having that contact with other people working in the same area has been immensely valuable. They're very smart people, and I've learned a heap through regular meetings and conversations with them. There's a Partnership Brokers Journal where they're specifically looking about what the challenges are for being a partnership broker. I think the one coming up next is all around the review space. That's a free online journal. As a broker, you often feel quite isolated, but in fact there's quite a lot going on out there, and it's a really good network to tie into.